Doom. Being a huge fan, I was waiting for Doom Eternal like Christmas, and I even pre-ordered, literally one day before the release, to get all the benefits after reading all the reviews. Never pre-order. But earlier, 1 week before Eternal released, I decided to have a Doom marathon. So I played Doom 2, Doom 3, and Doom 2016 in that order. So I literally finished Doom 2016 the day Doom Eternal came out, with main takeaway from all of this that I had the freshest memory of how the 2016 game played comparing to the new title. And Eternal surely played quite different, which was a pleasant surprise. I'm all for games and their sequels to actually be different and trying new things. Especially after my hand stopped switching weapon modes when I was trying to make a glory kill on a demon. The new game has glory kill at the E key instead of the F key, and the F key is doing the weapon mode switch. You get the point. But there was one thing that didn't feel very different. The graphics. Or should I say the level of graphics? Stylistically, the game is quite different, with many characters, pickups, and locations looking just like the Doom 1 and 2 design in full 3D glory. Kind of epic actually, and not something one could find in 2016 title. Now, before I continue, I'm obviously going to criticize Doom Eternal's graphics in this video, but I want everyone to know that the game itself is awesome, okay? Not like, hey, it was a great game with all the right things, blah blah. No. During the gameplay, the battles, there's this feeling of rush and adrenaline I don't think I've experienced in a game maybe ever. It's truly the next level experience that has you feeling the gameplay with your gut at an unprecedented pace. Mind blown. That level of graphics though. Don't get me wrong, the game looks great. The game looks great. It just doesn't really look 2020. In fact, the detail is about the same it was in 2016. Admittedly, with much bigger environments, which is a big deal. I'm not saying there was no improvement on the technological side. Sometimes textures being sharper here and there, though sometimes that also varies. And the big question is, I'm not really sure why that happened. Like all the benchmarks and my personal experience showing crazy high refresh rates. Kind of an overkill. What's interesting, I read a lot of different reviews and articles before the game came out that promised that Doom Eternal will send your graphics card to hell and all that stuff. Sure, in the modern age of the 4K 200 plus FPS nonsense, not a huge fan, but there is a room for that kind of optimization, some performance to save. Yet still, there's no reason for the game's Ultra Nightmare mode to not show something more detailed than this. Like geometry, where are them vertices? Where's the cool modern complexity with extra alpha textures and tessellation? Aside from that, shaders, textures, post-processing look fantastic, as it did in 2016. But I do love me some cinematic HDR motion blur at 60 FPS. Also, id Tech 7, the new engine from id Software that's being used in Doom Eternal, it dropped that previously used mega texture technology, and the good riddance resulted in sharper textures on bigger environments. And personally, I kinda like the new never commented on temporal sampling technology that sort of resamples even the perfectly still objects over and over again. So if you have like super sharp highlights on a gun that can't be perfectly visualized with 8 samples per pixel in one frame, is just getting this kind of a filmic grainy motion that on average gives you a better impression on what that highlight actually looks like. Also, the image overall feels a bit more alive that way. Not a perfect way of doing this, but I still like it. However, when I just look at the environment, I notice most secondary objects are rocking this pretty low poly count, and that's in my monitor's full HD resolution. Now I can only imagine what 4K 240Hz would look like. Even more pixels to show spiky polygons sticking out here and there, with no motion blur magic, because that makes no sense at high refresh rates. Doesn't really look like next gen to me. Now look, maybe that's not exactly true, or only partially true. This is just my impression, and it's not like I have the access to the assets to look at their wireframes and such. Some objects are too simple indeed, but it's not always the problem. So I had to look closer and speculate. I think the great contribution to many assets looking somewhat meh was either overly flat shading or the lack of what I would call geometrical normal mapping. I noticed while there is always a full set of maps applied to every object, like color map, normal map, specular map, and probably even more sometimes, the problem is in the way the normal map was created. You see, modern games use a lot of this trickery when objects are modeled, or sculpted, in much higher detail. The kind of detail that would work for like a Hollywood movie. But then, all of that detail is projected onto a much simpler shape. That way, even though a final model is very blocky, it reacts to lighting the way that super detailed version did. That's what normal maps can do. But that's not always the case. A quicker and draftier way to create an asset is to build the simple blocky model right away, and then just apply a material on it that has its own normal map. Like this mountain. It has a normal map. We can see these tiny bumps on it reacting to the light the way this obviously simple shape wouldn't be able to. But those details only tell us about this rocky soil texture, not the shape of the mountain in general, because its high detail version was never sculpted. It's just the soil material that can be applied to any object and have the same bumpy look. The shape of the mountain is only described with this handful of polygons. And I look at it, and I hate it. I also noticed that lower quality of assets usually happens in natural objects. Rocks, ground, some foliage and litter. All the things that id Software probably have little experience in. Because the usual Doom stuff, the sci-fi metallic hard surface objects, are just perfect. Look at that stuff. But Doom Eternal has this much bigger universe with all kinds of detail, some of which appeared to have gotten less love. And while the big-scale natural locations are more demanding than smaller labs and corridors, I still noticed that many elements could use a higher polygon count for more complex silhouettes. And id Tech 7 was specifically presented by the studio as capable of handling much bigger amounts of polygons per frame. Cause I can tell with my pretty average rig right now that there's more than enough performance for that kind of thing. Now there are some speculations on the web on why we got such light graphics on this AAA title in 2020. Most notable one is the promised update that's coming to Doom Eternal sometime in the near future that will introduce ray tracing to the mix. Generally, developers didn't put the whole RTX thing at the higher priority during the development. We could get RTX in Doom Eternal Day 1, but later it was postponed due to the Nvidia's late release of the RTX extension for Vulkan API, which is, by the way, the only API Doom Eternal was developed on, which is dope. Also, studio director Marty Stratton said, and I quote, "There's more that you can use the technology for than just the reflections and the shadows and the real-time lighting and that kind of stuff." End of quote. Which is an interesting topic. What the hell was he talking about? We can use ray tracing for more than all the ray tracing goodies. The only thing that comes to my mind, coming from like 3D rendering experience and all that, you can have depth of field effect using ray tracing. Like you can pretty much ray trace everything, including the physics of the light coming through the lens of the camera. I don't know, these guys are doing some black magic in their engines all the time, so I probably have no idea what they mean. But that brings us to another topic, lighting. Like again, it looks great, no problem with that. Just right for the style, the really flat kind of lighting really sells the just like original Doom style. I think it's a great look. But really, technically, where is lighting in this game? Where are shadows? Can you find a single dark spot in that game? except for the endless holes, of course. It seemed like Doom Eternal mostly handles lighting with intense ambient occlusion and shaders magic, plus some quite secondary projected shadows from some models and clouds. But what the hell are they gonna be using ray tracing for? I guess the quote from before kinda answers the question. They are gonna have to be quite creative with implementing it then. But honestly, I kinda think that this is gonna be one of those titles that introduces ray tracing a lot later, and the whole game was kind of developed for the version without ray tracing, so adding ray tracing is not gonna really show up anywhere, except for dropping your frame rates. Like Reflections, not a lot of room for that either. Again, as yet another title that was developed to look good without RTX. Doom Eternal never really shows any highly reflective, complex objects or surfaces that would really benefit from ray tracing. So unless the future update is gonna bring some pretty intense changes to the way the game looks like, changing some design decisions and the looks of the materials, then there's no real point to it. Again, all we can do right now is wait and see what they come up with. Now back to the whole next-gen question, here's something for a good perspective. Shadow of the Tomb Raider looks way better than Doom Eternal. I'm gonna say it right now, right here, pretty much in everything. That game actually looks like a movie or a reality in a way. Also features ray tracing and came out 2 years ago. Is that true? Did it really come out 2 years ago? September 2018, I was right. Now, maybe it's not exactly fair to compare the two games, since Tomb Raider is much less of a shooter and much more of a walking, running, crawling, and sightseeing experience, so they really didn't have to think about higher than 60 FPS performance, and it's third person, which makes it a lot less likely for you to smash your camera against some wall to see every single pixel of any texture. But first-person shooters also have some tricks up their sleeves. Like, you don't have to render the super high detailed protagonist all the time. You can see your own feet or your own shadow in Doom Eternal. And it's not like it's a huge competitive cyber sports kind of thing. Doom is still a single player game first, and the game came out 2 years later than the Shadows of the Tomb Raider. So if a game from 2018 can demand more from my GTX 1080, why can't Doom Eternal deliver extra detail when RTX 20 series and 20 Super series are ready to be fried? One thing to keep in mind though, Shadow of the Tomb Raider may appear better looking to me because it has a nicer design, which has little to do with technological aspect of the game. Doom Eternal is, well, a remake of a very old game, so maybe the levels look somewhat flat and empty specifically to give you the feeling you had when playing Doom 1 and 2. What's interesting though is that Shadow of the Tomb Raider is also a remake of a very old game that used to be very flat and empty. So there's that. Anyway, we can probably all agree that id Software didn't intentionally downgrade geometry in their greatest Doom installment ever for the sake of the ray tracing update that's probably coming months after the initial release, bringing barely any difference to the visuals anyway. It does seem, however, that the devs have a special place in their hearts for refresh rates. Both Doom Eternal and Doom 64 that comes bundled with it are supporting gameplay with 1000 frames per second. Why? I haven't yet figured out how to end these. Discuss. Time will tell. That's the way you end these, right? We don't know yet. It's true.